All right, let's get going. So, many accounts of the modern plain language movement actually start in 1975 in the USA, when Citibank quite famously released a plain English revision of the promissory note, which was part of its consumer loan contract. Now, a couple of years earlier, they'd had a run-in with another movement, the consumer movement. A group called Nader's Raiders, which was an investigative group set up by the famous consumer advocate Ralph Nader, had released this 400 and something page report about how awful Citibank was. Obviously, this was bad PR, and in the wake of this incident, Citibank decided, or one of Citibank's employees, Duncan McDonald, suggested they needed to get someone external in to come and help them clean house. So they brought in Bess Meissen, pictured here, who was another prominent consumer advocate of the day. And together, McDonald and Meissen worked on a range of reforms at Citibank, among them this plain English promissory note. Now, that note was released to a lot of fanfare. It got media attention. It was hailed as a breakthrough by consumer activists. It won them market share. It reduced their need to take legal action against customers. And with all that success, it helped to inspire state and federal regulations mandating plain English disclosure for consumers. So I want to go on and talk a bit about what's happened in consumer markets and in consumer policy since then. But first, let's break down why is it that these two movements were so intertwined. Well, consumer policy and consumer activism is all about the goal of consumer welfare, and this has always been viewed through the lens of what we might call an information paradigm. So this is basically classical economics 101. It's the idea that in theory, humans are kind of rational actors. We're going around making sensible, consistent decisions in our own interests. And by doing this, we're maximising our own welfare, and we're also promoting efficient functioning of markets. Information is an absolutely central concept here because it's understood as the basis for consumers making those rational decisions. And this is why the issue of information asymmetry, which is the fact that consumers generally know a lot less about their products and services than sellers do, this problem has been a kind of central analytical basis for consumer policy and consumer law, and a key concern that it tries to address. Well, of course, plain language practitioners, we also go to bed at night dreaming about the free flow of information. Our particular obsession is the mechanics of this. So how do we transfer information from one line to another by making it easy to find, understand and use? So it's easy to see why these two movements came together in this way. It was because plain language promised to be the tool that would take consumer policy and consumer law from merely disclosing information to actually communicating it. And the explicit claim underlying that in the 70s was that by doing this, we would make sure that consumers understood the agreements they were making and that their decision making would be improved. All right, a lot has changed since 1975. Markets are eating everything. They've really penetrated more areas of life. So more of life is a consumer issue. We've seen regulated monopolies like telecommunications and energy give way to competitive markets. Also financial services markets have grown, and in other areas like transport as well. And then more recently, certainly in Australia, competition and that kind of whole approach to things is making more and more inroads into the human services, so things like aged care, disability services and so on. Now, it follows when we think about this development with that information paradigm in mind, it follows that as markets are created, consumers will have more of a need for information. So when there's no market, we just buy or we're given a product or service. There are no decisions to make, so we just do that and call it a day. But when there's a market, there's a greater need to firstly understand that the market is there, to know a bit about how it works, and to compare and assess the different options in the market. All right, second, just as markets have penetrated more areas of life, they've also grown increasingly complex. There are many, many more products and services on the market now than there were in 1975, and I've chosen the somewhat silly but illustrative example of the iconic Australian biscuit, a Tim Tam. There was one Tim Tam in 1986 when I was a toddler, and now there is all manner of Tim Tams. Now, it's one thing to face this kind of dazzling array of choice in the biscuit aisle of the supermarket, but when you're in the market for something like a complex financial product or a home loan, it's quite a different matter, and it's much more consequential. And this is just one of the dimensions of complexity. There are other dimensions. Firstly, the products and services themselves have become more complicated. Secondly, the pace of change has picked up, so things are hitting the market and becoming obsolete more quickly than they used to. And thirdly, and particularly in, say, the last 10 years, we're seeing blurring of some of the lines consumers are used to, so the line between what's a product and what's a service, and the lines between previously separate sectors like telecommunications and energy, for example, are starting to kind of merge into each other. And that creates analytical difficulties for consumers trying to compare like with like. All right, so at the same time as we've been facing this increased complexity in every area of life, policymakers are increasingly, I think, having to come to grips with the fact that, well, there's a limit to how much human beings can actually deal with this complexity. And the main development here has been the rise of behavioural economics. So this is the relatively newer branch of economics that uses research in cognitive psychology to look at how well actual human decision-making behaviour kind of stacks up against that theoretical idea in classical economics. And what they've found is that really human decision-making is less than perfectly rational. Surprise, surprise. We're heavily influenced by how information is framed. And when we're making decisions, we don't just accumulate all the available information, kind of calculate it through a machine and out pops the correct course of action. We actually rely on mental shortcuts, cognitive biases, just like the Dunning-Kruger effect that Julie just mentioned. Now these shortcuts are referred to as cognitive biases because they kind of systematically bias our decision-making and our thinking in ways that don't always lead to poor outcomes, but certainly can, particularly in the marketplace where sellers are often quite aware of these biases and will exploit them in the way they sell products to consumers. So, policymakers obviously have been very interested in these insights from behavioural economics and looking at how they can be applied in public policy. And consumer policy is certainly an obvious place to start. I think as far as plain language is concerned, this is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the positive side, it really, I think, translates into an intensified interest in the nitty-gritty of information provision. So I don't think you'll find many policymakers today who think, yeah, just, give them some information. They know that how it's provided, when, how much are matters that really are important. And this naturally lends itself to a continued interest in how plain language can contribute to more effective information disclosure. On the other hand, though, and here I'm going to be a bit critical of plain language, behavioural economics, I think, really confirms some of the long-held kind of doubts about this whole information paradigm and the whole idea that just disclosing information to consumers is going to be an effective tool for consumer protection and enhancing consumer welfare. People have been questioning this for quite a long time, even back in the 70s, but I think what behavioural economics has done is shown just how limited our processing power is, and it's provided really powerful, really high quality empirical evidence of this, and it's given a convincing account of the cognitive mechanisms, the psychological processes that are going on under the surface there. Now, we now know, for example, that, the majority of consumers aren't motivated to read general contract terms before they sign a contract. They're already psychologically committed to a purchase by the time they get to that point of looking at the contract. If they do attempt to read it, their processing capacity is quite quickly overwhelmed by information overload. And in interpreting contract terms, we're affected by biases like over-optimism and self-serving bias, which might lead us to interpret clauses as being more favourable to us than they really are. Now, it's worth noting that most of these critiques apply even to disclosure that's done in plain language. Perhaps not to the same extent, but they still apply. And in that sense, I think it's fair to say that behavioural economics findings really back up a bit some of the criticisms of plain language from the early days of the movement in the 70s. One really, I think, prescient critic in 1981 wrote that he questioned that underlying assumption that consumers would receive the information in plain language contracts and that they would crucially actually use that information to better their decision making in the marketplace. There's one really, actually I'll just go back, we're not there yet. There's one really interesting study that looked at this intersection of plain language and actual real life decision making, a Dutch study that was only published this year. I'll go on to talk about that in a moment. I wanted to note that behavioural economics really raises also this intriguing and somewhat disturbing possibility that in fact plain language itself can be potentially an unhelpful source of bias in consumer decision making. Why is this? It's because plain language research in cognitive psychology has quite convincingly shown that many of the positive effects of plain language are actually themselves the result of a cognitive bias called processing fluency. As we all know here, people who read plain language documents are apt to make all kinds of positive judgments about it. They think it's fairer, they think it's smarter, better looking, like pretty much any positive trait you can think of they will attribute to the document and its author. What's happening here psychologically is that the reader uses the experience of easy reading as a kind of clue or a piece of information to inform other judgments that are actually essentially unrelated about that content and about the author. As a plain language consultant, I love this unfair advantage. It's a really great selling point. But it's easy to see how it could, in some situations, be detrimental. So back to this Dutch study. What they did was they got a car insurance contract. Can't be bothered. And this was a real-life contract used by a real company and that had been revised from complex Dutch into plain Dutch. Oh, thank you. And they got consumers to read this contract, or they were given the contract and they were asked to imagine a particular claims scenario and say how much of the damage from this accident they thought would be compensated. Now, the people who read, the answer to this question was not actually in the contract terms. So the contract terms left it ambiguous, so we can't attribute this to improved understanding. But the people who read the plain Dutch version of the contract actually expected more of the damage to be compensated, so they interpreted the terms more favourably. This suggests that plain language can increase trust independent of whether it actually improves comprehension, disturbingly, and independent of, in a consumer context, how suitable that product or service actually is for the consumer. And I think we see this all around us in things like marketing, in politicians, not naming names, that use simple language without substance to back it up. All right, I'm going to have a now. So, for all the acknowledged limitations of mandatory disclosure tools in consumer law, not many people are suggesting that we do away with it, and certainly I'm not suggesting that we stop having mandatory disclosure of information, or that we stop trying to make it better through plain language and by other means. But what I am suggesting is that it would be great if some more of our focus could shift from that task of explaining the detailed terms and conditions of specific products and services to the broader task of just helping consumers to understand and navigate all these really complex markets that we find ourselves in. If I can use a personal experience to explain, I recently had to choose a new electricity tariff, and because of my familiarity with that industry, I kind of knew the lay of the land, and I was able to very quickly choose a tariff and a contract that I knew was a good decision without looking at any mandatory disclosures, without reading the contract or anything like that, because I had that contextual understanding. Imparting that kind of knowledge is the realm really of consumer education, and the financial capability work that David Boyle spoke about yesterday is a really perfect example of the kind of work I'm talking about. The people who deliver this kind of work, so government departments, community legal centres, consumer organisations, I think they pretty much all understand that plain language is important, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have the skills to pull it off. And in particular, I think this work of explaining markets requires those kind of higher level plain language skills of the conceptual work of structuring information better, not just using simpler words. It also needs that reader-obsessed mindset we have, where I think we're better able to pick up gaps and failures in information that subject matter experts can just go right over their heads. So from my observation, both within the consumer movement, in external dispute resolution schemes, and now as a plain language consultant, I think there are 4 key tasks that consumers need help with where plain language can help. There we go. Firstly, orienting. Consumers need help to get their bearings in complex markets, particularly in new markets that have just been opened up to competition. It's the difference really between just giving a close-up photo of one little part of the terrain or giving people a map. I think the map is more helpful, particularly at the outset. Secondly, connecting. Documents with important consumer information need to connect to those consumers' actual goals and values, the things that they know already are important. Because if you can't see why a document's relevant to you, you're just not going to engage with it. Particularly today in this kind of attention economy, it's just not good enough. Third, filtering. There are hard limits on how much people can take in, and unfortunately that limit is far less than the amount you could say about any given product or service. So hard decisions have to be made about what will be prioritised, what will be left out. And I think plain language practitioners can help to make that call. For comparing, this is perhaps the most difficult task in modern markets, and in some cases it does actually take complex algorithms and like massive data sets to make a really rational decision about which product is best for you, and that's why we've seen the rise of tools like price comparison websites and other decision-making tools. These are great, but they need input from plain language professionals and other user experience type professionals. I've certainly witnessed in my state, the state government pour millions of dollars into developing a wonderful comparator that languished unused for years because it just, despite the brilliance of the underlying architecture, it just wasn't usable. They've fixed it now, don't worry. Okay. I'm being quite honest here. I sometimes wish I was born in hunter-gatherer times. I just think it would have been much more simple, much more relaxing, you know, notwithstanding not having sewerage and iPhones and so on. But instead, I was born in the 20th century and now live in this really complex and kind of cognitively overwhelming 21st century. Consumers today are more in need of decision-making help than they were in 1975 and that they've ever been before, in fact, which mean that our skills in cutting through the noise with simplicity and with relevance are more important than ever before. But to have the biggest impact, we need to be directing those skills to where they're needed most. Thanks.